name is Kate Erricker. I am hosting your webinar today. My job is Assistant Director of Anglia University, which is basically the professional development arm of Anglia International Schools Group. And the focus for our webinar today is learning subject content in English, and it's going to be on practical strategies for EAL learners, whether they're learning in the classroom or whether they're learning at home online, which is something that's really relevant at the moment. So just a couple of housekeeping points. Could everybody make sure that their microphone is on mute? And also that your video is on mute for the moment. And when we do some more interactive tasks later, I might ask you to unmute and we can have a bit more of a chat. So the aims of this webinar, the first one is to become familiar with a range of practical tasks and teaching strategies that you can use to support either primary or secondary learners in the classroom or online. And also to know how to adapt texts into a sequence of practical activities that build understanding of both language and subject content. Often when EAL learners are learning, they'll be using a text that has been set by a class teacher to do with their subject, and not necessarily because it's the best fit for their language ability. So this webinar will focus on how we adapt those texts to make them easy for our EAL learners to access. Okay, thank you to anybody who's just joined. These are the aims of the webinar here. I'm just going to move on now to thinking about planning. So if we start with planning, and when we're planning a lesson, when learning subject content in English, we need to focus on both the content, so what's going to be learned in the lesson, and then also the language, the means by which that content is going to be learned. And the important thing is that we build in active tasks that focus on these two elements, so that the children that we're teaching learn how to do things, how to interact with that content, how to do the necessary things for that subject, as well as know things, to know the content in another language. So there are three main dimensions here. And what I'm leaning on quite heavily in this webinar is the idea of CLIL. So that's content and language integrated learning. Any colleagues out there from Hong Kong University will be quite familiar with this model, because I know that the text I used when I wrote this webinar is a set text on your course if you're doing a course on EAL. So when we think about subject-based learning for our EAL learners, we think about the conceptual content, and that's the ideas and the knowledge that's being taught or learned. The procedural content, so that's the how of the curriculum. That's the skills and demands of a particular subject area. So how to talk or write or think like a scientist or a geographer. And also the procedures, the classroom methods that support the development of those skills. Finally, we have the language, and that's the key language needed to express this content in an appropriate way for the subject. We can think about these three elements almost as a mixing desk, like one of those old-fashioned sound decks. And this is an analogy used in this text by Phil Ball and others. This idea is that you have three volume controls. You can either focus heavily on the concepts that you're learning in the science or geography lesson, or you can focus on the procedures, the how to do it, or you can focus on the language and the meanings of the words. And when you're planning, it helps to have a sense in your head of which aspect you're going to focus on most heavily, because it's very, very difficult for EAL learners if they're trying to focus equally heavily on all of these three aspects at once. So you start with your text. And this is the text that the teacher, your co-teacher, might have already chosen, or it might be a text that you need to learn because the exam board has set it, or it might be a text that is just out there and fits your topic. So this could mean anything. By text, I mean video clips or web pages or podcasts. There could be a wide range of text here. The one I've chosen to focus on in this webinar, I took from National Geographic, and it was just a web page. I pulled it out as a good example of what subject content could look like when it's just sort of out there in the world. So I have my text, and this is my starting place. And I know this is where I'm going to go from. And I know that I'm planning together with other teachers who might be teaching the same content matter. And the first thing I'm going to do is read through this key text in advance, then highlight the keywords. If, apologies, I'm using a verbal text, I might go through this verbal model. I might listen to it in advance. Then I pick out the keywords and I highlight the key sentence structures that I want to focus on. It's really important I know what these are in advance. Then I use these elements to help me develop my objectives for the lesson. And these might be similar to, but slightly different from, the co-teacher that I'm working with if I'm working alongside another subject teacher or I'm working alongside another class teacher. I'll consider how I might pre-teach this key language in advance, and then think about the active procedures that I'm going to use to help my learners interact with the language and grammar of the text. So here's an example. If, as we're going to be doing today, we're focusing on climate change, the objective for the lesson in general might be to know the causes and effects of climate change. When I'm thinking about my EAL learners in particular, I want to think about the procedures we're going to follow. So to be able to verbally summarize, it might be a lesson where we're focusing on talking. The concepts, which are the same, the issue of climate change, and also the key language that might be used, using grammatical structures linking cause and effect. By wording my objectives in this way, it makes it very clear and very specific exactly how my EAL learners are going to be supported in developing their language skills whilst looking at the issues around climate change. When we think about planning for EAL teaching online, there are a certain number of disadvantages. One is that we are lacking an authentic communicative context. We have lost the classroom. And so it is difficult for our learners who don't speak English at home to be able to practice in the same way. They have fewer opportunities to practice. And it can also be harder for teachers to support in the moment, like you would intervene in a lesson or in a classroom, supporting working alongside your students. However, there are also huge advantages to supporting language learners online. And one is that it's asynchronous. So students have more time to prepare for the lesson and to study in advance. And also they can study at their own pace. And there is also, especially when using videos, an easily accessible record of lesson content. So you can go back and revisit and repeat content when needed. There's also a lot of technology out there that can support language learners. And I'm going to touch on just a little bit of that in later slides in this webinar. So if we start thinking about procedures, the strategies that I referred to earlier in the aims of this webinar, I've got just a few here that we're going to look at. I'm not necessarily going to focus in the same amount of detail on every single one, but I'm going to try and cover most of them. And if you did want to get in touch afterwards and to talk about any that you'd like to discuss in more detail, that's absolutely fine. I'm going to be sending out a recording of this with my email address afterwards, and you'll feel free to get in touch. So we're going to start up here in the orange circle with pre-activity language practice. So if we think about pre-activity language practice, a common way to do this is by sharing word lists in advance. So we consider the key content that will be taught in the lesson and the key words and small phrases that learners will need to know. Once we know what those are, we present learners with these words before we share the text, so separately from sharing the whole article or whichever text we're going to use. Now, these could be shared as a list, or they could be shared in a more interactive format. So this is the text I sent out in advance to people as a pre-task. So if anybody's had a chance to think about it, feel free to type the keywords that you'd focus on if you were teaching this text to a language learner who might find like the level of this text slightly difficult. Which keywords would you focus on? And if you'd like to unmute your mic and say them, that's absolutely fine as well. Feel free to use the chat box or to talk. Okay, so we've got climate change, climate, species, polar and habitat, polar and climate, species. Could somebody just unmute their microphone and say why they chose that word? So we've got temperature there as well from Colleen.
I basically look at words that I think my students wouldn't know.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so choosing things you think might be unfamiliar. Thank you. Did anybody have any other reasons? Unpredictable and rise have come up there.
I picked species. The reason I picked species was because it comes up in both paragraphs, and it's not a word, as was just mentioned, that is going to come up regularly in conversation, and it also is quite important for them to understand the meaning of it in order to understand the meaning of the text.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for that. If we then take that as an example, that these might be the words that we'd share. Thank you, William. Tier 3 words doesn't come up in conversation. That's actually where I'm going next. So that's a lovely segue into the next one. When we think about which words to choose, I'm leaning on Isabel Beck's work here in bringing words to life. There are sort of 3 levels of words that we can choose. So like William said there, we've got tier 3 words, which are subject specific, and they have a low frequency of use. You might not hear it elsewhere so much. So climate change as a concept might come in there. Climate, we might have industrial potentially, species. Tier 2 words are sophisticated words. They're used orally by mature language users. So we could say actually that species might sit in tier 2, because we might use it in conversation when we were talking to people. It's not necessarily specific to just one subject. Our tier 2 words are the language of written texts, and they're also the language of academia. They're the words that our students need to master to succeed in education as they go through. And tier 1 words are our basic and most frequently occurring words like boys or eaten, shops, words like that we'll hear all the time. So as teachers, we're working around tier 2 and tier 3. And tier 2 are the interesting ones because they're the ones, like approximately there, Stephanie, thank you, the ones that we might see in lots of different places, but they're slightly more sophisticated than the ones we generally hear in the playground. So what we've got here is a bag of words. It's like a word list, except it's been set out in a disparate way on purpose. So here, in advance of sharing the text and in advance probably of sharing the topic, I might put out there some of my tier 2 and tier 3 words to encourage my students to interact with the text and think about the links and connections they're going to make in advance. And this is a really nice example of sort of a low threshold, high ceiling task where your struggling language learners will have more time to interact with the words that they don't know. But your more capable language learners, those who need more of a challenge, will have an opportunity to think about the connections and do some inference work and some prediction. So can we just look at this for a second and think about, if you were seeing this for the first time, which words would you want to group together? Now, you already know the topic, so you've got a bit of a head start. But which ones would you want to put together into one sort of grouping? For example, extreme and unpredictable. Would those words sit together? Type in the chat box or unmute. Okay, I like it. Habitat and Amazon rainforest go together. We've got fossil fuels and human activity. Polar animals and cows, I guess an animal grouping. Fossil fuels and human activity from Joe. So what I would ask students to do now is to explain their grouping. So could somebody unmute and explain why they group those words together? Okay, I'm going to pick polar animals and cows. Could Roya maybe unmute and say if you're comfortable to, or if not, I'm happy for someone else to.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm glad to share.
Thank
I
you.
just think about that. Polar animals are and cows are all belong to. They all belong to animals. So that's why I put them together.
Great, thank you. And that's exactly the kind of thing you could ask your students to do. And then they could make their groupings bigger and bigger and consider how they'd put them together. So here I linked human activity, Amazon rainforest and habitat, thinking that it's human activity that has destroyed the Amazon rainforest as a habitat for animals. And you could ask your students to sketch what they think will be in the text or put it in a process level diagram, something like that, to sort of make their understanding visual after they've done this task. I think an important thing to remember here is that these tasks are most useful when we're working on building in high quality student talk. So we're moving from a continuum once we've done some pre-teaching, and pre-teaching is also an opportunity for student talk and to verbalize their understanding. But we're moving from comprehensible teacher talk and presenting new concepts and considering how we provide high quality verbal models and written models, through to teacher techniques to prompt good high quality talk in learners' responses and bridge the gap between where their talk is now and where we want it to be. And then finally, the production of pupil talk. And that can be an outcome in itself. So something like a presentation or an extended conversation where they try to verbalize their understanding. So thinking about talk is something I want to do in this webinar a little bit, because it is a danger that if we focus too heavily on reading and writing, when we're delivering virtual schooling like we are now, then those opportunities for student talk can be lost. So this is where I'd like to take us next. So William, I'm going to play your video as an example of a really high quality verbal model. Now, William is on the line for this webinar. So William, after I've played it, could you just chip in a little bit and sort of talk through your process in making this? Is that okay?
Okay, can we see the video? I'm going to press play. Sound. So it's me, Mr. William, and today we're going to talk about the word because. Now, I might be thinking, why am I wearing a hat? I'm not going to tell you, because I want you to tell me, why am I wearing a hat? Can you send a video or write a sentence and send your video to me and put it in the because portfolio? You can start your speaking or your sentence with, I think you are wearing a hat because. Now, let's move on. So we're talking about the word because, and we use this word to connect two sentences together. And now I'm going to give you some examples of how to do that.
That's great. Thank you, William. So that was a really great example of there. It was a high quality verbal model that used dual coding to help students understand how to construct a specific sentence structure. So William, what I really liked about what you were doing there was the way that you used props to make the sentence structure clear. And the worksheet that went with this connected the two sentences together using visuals in the same way. Did you want to talk briefly about this?
Sure, just one other thing when teaching EAL online, it's not just about teaching, it's like capturing your audience. So right at the beginning, I asked a question saying, why do you think I'm wearing a hat? Because I want to get them speaking. And I asked them to send a short video of speaking to me so I could just continue their speaking practice at home. Then you've got the worksheets, which they can print or just use paper. And it's quite clear to read. This is for year 1, by the way, KS1, year 1. And it's got some visuals, just in case they can't read the word. You've got the visual there to explain the sentence and then an example. They've done really well, actually.
Thank you. And I like the way that you engaged your pupils there to encourage the talk. And the task that you had as an outcome for that was a talk task. Now, the visuals used to create this from an organization called Widget, and I've put a QR code up there if people want to have a quick look at it, if you want to scan that on your phone, or if you want to go on the website later, it's there. Another thing that's used at William's school, and I spoke to one of his colleagues the other day, is Class Dojo. And if you're encouraging pupils to send in videos of them talking, this is a really nice forum in which you can do that encourages them to record themselves speaking and then put it up on the shared area. It's also free to use. For older children, if you're not using Class Dojo, Flipgrid is a really nice way to do this. And another thing that's really accessible as a form of technology for EAL learners is the Read and Write app for Google Chrome, which you can install onto your browser, and it will then play any bit of text that you have on a web page back to students. Now, this might not play for some reason if the sound isn't working on mine, but what I did do is make just a little video of how the Read Write app works. So you install this taskbar and you can call up any word you've got there within a dictionary, which is helpful. But what you can also do is select the sentences that you want to play out loud and they will read. I'm not sure if you could hear the sound on that one, but what you probably could do was see the little blue box moving along to indicate that that was what was being read out loud. Another effective way of supporting learner talk in a talk sequence is to provide visuals annotated with key language. And this is quite a simple thing to do. And this is again from this CLIL book that I've been leaning on to sort of find very practical strategies for EAL learners. So for example, sharing this visual on acid rain, learners could listen to a description of the process. They could have that in front of them when listening to a strong verbal model about acid rain, then use that new understanding to label the diagram, as is shown here. Then they could recreate the process description as written notes, or a diagram, or a passage, and finally record themselves describing the process. So essentially what they've done is scaffolded their own talk up to a final outcome. Substitution tables are another good way to do this. So William, you put a coloured marker along a talk sequence or sentence in a book for reading, so that students can follow the words as you speak. That's another useful strategy, thank you. Similar to the coloured dots that we're moving along the web page there. So thinking about substitution tables now as a way of freeing up students of thinking about language too much, but thinking about content and curriculum-based learning. So if we're thinking about how we want students to join words together, it can be easier if we give this to them, if we want them to kind of get to grips with the subject content and how you express yourself in a certain way in a subject. So for example, as a scientist, for example. So substitution tables can be used for single or multiple sentence construction or for producing paragraphs. And there's one here where we're thinking about calculations for speed and velocity, acceleration. These are quite complicated concepts. So if we want our students to get to grips with the concepts, then we could put this substitution table in place to enable them to start using their brain power on the complexity of those calculations and how to express that, rather than worry too much about sentence construction. So this is a nice example of quite a simple substitution table that we could use for younger learners. And we've got a diagram there, but also the substitution table laid out underneath. And by moving between the different aspects, we could also help to understand if they understood the process of what's happening in the diagram. If we're making a substitution table, if we've got a text and we just want to put one together, the process is quite straightforward. So we start with the text. We can identify key sentences in the text and then put these key structures into a table that students can then use to bolt their sentences together. So if we look at this one, and then maybe have a bit of a think about which key sentence structures and phrase structures would you focus on? If you just had this and you wanted your students to really be focusing on the concept of climate change, how could you break down these sentence structures to help them so that they could put something together themselves that would structure their own talk later? So which key sentences and phrase structures would you want to look at? There's another nice couple of examples from Carleen and William here in the chat box if you take a look, about simple, easy to use symbols at nounproject.com and a KTV style dot in the classroom for time adverbial plus noun plus verb plus noun. So if anybody wants to pick out a key sentence or phrase structure and just type it in the chat box or talk about it. And if not, I've got some examples in a minute. Okay, the use of a relative clause, whose. Yes, I picked up on whose, that's a good one. Okay, so this is quite a complex thing to do live. Our reporting, if I believe that, yeah. So if you haven't had a chance to look at the pre-task so much, then you can go back and do this actually with any text that you can take from the curriculum content that you want to look at. So for example, we could put our animal names in one box here, polar animals, seal species, sea turtles, then put our relative clauses here, and then put the things that our relative clauses would match with. So polar bears who need sea ice to be able to hunt, or sea species, seal species which make caves in snow and ice to raise their pups, feed and mate. And this would enable your learners to sort of bolt together sentences to demonstrate their understanding of climate change in a spoken way with a useful scaffold that it still has some flexibility within it. And this is something you can do when you're interacting with any text to break it down for learners who need a bit more structure. I've left an example there that you can go back to. That one's just expanded to include more of the sentence. So it gets progressively more complex. And when I made that, I just went through and color-coded different parts of the sentence that could be bolted together. So the last thing I'm going to talk about very briefly are graphic organizers. which can be used as another really useful way for EAL learners to access information from a text and turn it into a process structure, or to create a structure that will support them in talk outcomes later on. So there's a number of graphic organizer structures here, which come from the Bell Foundation's EAL resources, which are free to access. One particularly nice way to do this is with concept maps. So where you include your key vocabulary, but in the lines in between, you have your discourse markers. Now, these are more advanced ones. These are ones for maybe secondary or Key Stage 5, so your post-16 learners. But by including the discourse markers, it actually does the same job as a substitution table, where they can put the words together with the relevant sentence structures. We've got one drawn by a student up here that's taken from this paper, which I include at the end, and this very scientific one here. A nice task for students to do is to have paired speaking with a gapped concept map where they have to talk to each other using those sentence structures. And this is also something that you can do online if you've got students in groups in Teams calls where they have separate examples and they talk to each other to fill them in. It also works obviously very well as a classroom task. So overall, what we're thinking about here is a progression of pupil talk, going from private talk, how students will talk to themselves and internalize information, to semi-public talk, to public talk, the public talk where we want them to talk in front of other people. And we take them through this process by identifying key terms, keywords and phrases, using visuals, allowing time to think. In the classroom, we'd move to small group work and discussions, and this can still be done online, but it's more difficult. By modeling language, making phrases and concepts visible, and providing students with opportunities to interact with different kinds of phrases and sentence structures. And then asking students to do presentations with visuals or giving frames for written answers or for spoken answers when they present. If we think about what this could look like, the least amount of language support we want to provide is a model. The most we could provide could range from notes plus annotated visuals to scripts, semi-scripts where parts are filled in, word lists that they could use, and models. So there's a progression here. And this is a useful way to think about differentiation as well. How many of these options do your students need to be able to talk confidently within the classroom, or to be able to present confidently to other people in a language that isn't their first language? And finally, just to return, because this is quite a quick webinar, but I would like to continue the discussion and share resources later. And I'll be sharing a Padlet in the post-webinar email so that we can start sharing resources on that as well. So overall, when we're thinking about how to support our EAL learners in the classroom, it's a process. Some of it sits with the planning, where we go to our key texts in advance and identify our keywords and sentence structures, picking out the key linguistic and grammatical elements we want to focus on, thinking about how we might pre-teach key language in advance and support with high quality verbal models and active procedures to help our learners interact with the language and the grammar of the text. Okay, I know we're slightly longer than intended. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Feel free to unmute your microphone if you want to share any good practice that you've used yourself, or to ask any questions about strategies that I've shared during the webinar. Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, William. You've put something else. Could you just talk through what you've written there with the sentence structure and adjective and noun and verb?
Oh, hello. So
Hiya.
the bit I wrote just there is it's like a graphic organizer. You can have a pile of cards for each part. So you have different sentence starters. If you're working with adjectives, you can have a pile of adjectives and so on. So for this one, I did a topic on animals in the jungle. So you could have something like could be a sentence starter. There are big elephants stomping under the tall trees in the jungle. So the the students can choose different nouns and different adjectives, but follow that sentence structure.
That's lovely. So it's almost like a substitution table, but with piles of different cards in different places, and they select out from the cards on the table.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. That's really accessible for younger learners. Thank you, William. I'm not sure whether there's software for concept maps, Joe. I like them too. Could have a bit of a search. There was some there's some interesting papers on them. People have used them to support in language learners. I'll see what I can find. I'll send out some links. Any other questions or good practice to share? Okay. WS to make mind maps. Oh, Poplets. Okay, that might be worth looking into. Thank you, Iris. If I send out a link to a Padlet later, could you pop in a link to that? That would be really helpful. Fantastic. Okay, so feel free to keep collaborating. Thanks, Iris. Feel free to keep collaborating after this call. It's quite a nice way to set up a community of learners who have something to share around a common topic. So I'll find a place that we can all do that together. In the meantime, and I know we've had a couple of audio problems with the video today, but here are my sources, my bibliography. So if you want to click on any of those books, there's some really nice Erasmus resources and also some other bits and pieces there. These are the books I've referred to in the making of the webinar. But if you could give me some feedback overall, we ask for feedback at the end of each of our webinars at the moment. This is a model that we only moved to a couple of months ago, so this helps us to get better every time. So if you could use the QR code or I send out the link in the post-event email, that would be really helpful. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, William. Thank you for your help.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gemma.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay, I'm going to end the meeting now. Thank you, everybody. Bye.